afternoon, everyone. Afternoon from Maine, that is. I know some of your other parts of the world. Welcome to the latest GeoTalks Express, session 11. We've been doing this for 11 weeks, or 11 sessions. Today's theme, as you can see on the slide, terrain analysis. This is a popular one. We knew it was going to be a popular one. I think we're bursting at the seams today with folks interested in this aspect of Global Mapper. We're going to be introducing a couple of different geographic locations and numerous different workflows to illustrate some of the terrain analysis functionality in Global Mapper. I'm joined today by my colleague, Katrina Schweikert. Good afternoon, Katrina. Are you there?
I am. Hello, David.
Hello. Have you managed to corral the cats? We were hearing some cats in the background a minute ago. Hopefully they're not going to interfere too much with you. Keep them stowed away. That's great. We are going to be going through, as I said, the terrain analysis functions of Global Mapper, introducing things like contour generation, volume calculation. We've already had a few questions come in asking very specific questions. So you're going to have an opportunity to ask those questions as we introduce these various components, these various elements of the software. Before we begin, let me just make sure my slideshow is activated here. A couple of necessary housekeeping items. You are in listen-only mode. Those of you who have been through our webinars in the past will understand that we can't hear you. You will be able to hear Katrina and myself, but unfortunately we can't hear you. So we have that questions panel over on the right side of your screen. That's your opportunity to ask whatever questions you want about the content that we're covering, about some of the workflows, asking for some more details. We will try to answer some of those questions in the context of the presentation. We'll ask them verbally or maybe answer them in writing, but we will certainly follow up with all of the questions after the close of our session. We'll send you emails, and we'll also post the questions and answers on a blog as well. So those of you who want to maybe watch a follow-up, we'll see what questions were asked and which answers were provided as well. Questions panel, as I mentioned. The session is being recorded. You will be able to watch a recording of this. Obviously, if you're watching the recording, you'll find that already. It will be on our GeoTalks playlist, along with the other presentations that we've been conducting over the last number of months. Obviously, we're constrained here in terms of how we can interact with customers. This format has given us an opportunity to share a lot of what we're doing here at Blue Marble with Global Mapper and some of our other applications. A few sessions coming up. We are going to be revisiting a theme that was one of our first presentations from back in March. Billy Noble and myself will be doing tips and tricks. This is a little kind of hidden gems in Global Mapper. Maybe some of the functionality that you're not familiar with, these little hidden tools that are always very popular. So that will be coming up 2 weeks from today. We're going to talk about scripting, a more specific application of the use of Global Mapper for data processing. This has changed, by the way. Our schedule changed a little bit. We're adjusting some of our release schedules, so we actually brought this one forward a little bit. So if you're interested in scripting, 2nd of September is when we're scheduled to deliver that presentation. I'm going to towards the middle of September talk a little bit about our training. We're going to kind of unravel or unrolls what we're going to be doing for training going forward. Obviously, we're moving a lot of our training content online. We're actually in the middle of doing a training class right now, a multi-day training class. So we'll be kind of introducing online training. We'll give you a little bit of preview as to what to expect in a training class, and that will be our September 16th session. All information about these and the additional sessions, I believe we have them scheduled up to November now, and we will continue to add additional GeoTalks Express sessions, and information is available on our website, bluemarblegeo.com/GeoTalksXP. So for today, this is a good one. This is one that we've been looking forward to. This is where we start to play with some of the fun tools in Global Mapper. The broad theme that we're going to be covering today is terrain analysis. And when we were thinking about how to divide this content up, I kind of thought of this idea of dividing into 3 parts. There's visual analysis. This is the very basics. How do we view terrain? How do we render terrain as a way to kind of interpret what we're looking at? So under that kind of umbrella, we'll take a look at shaders, the idea of applying colors to a terrain layer. We'll look at some contouring. We'll develop a quiver plot. You may not be familiar with this. This is a way to visualize point data to reflect some variables. I'm not going to spoil the plot here, but no pun intended. But we'll take a look at a quiver plot to visualize or represent terrain. And we'll also introduce our profiling tool. Some of you have used Global Map will be familiar with profiling. We use this in a lot of different contexts. But again, these are all kind of ways to visualize, to visually represent the terrain for visual analysis. We'll move into what we would consider to be quantitative analysis. These are more about the numbers. I'm going to do a little bit of exercise on volume calculation. There are a number of different variations on this theme. The idea of calculating volume, we've got cut and fill, we've got simple pile volume calculation. I'm going to do a slight variation on that to illustrate kind of an alternative application for calculating volume or calculating capacity. And we'll talk about some of the terrain statistics as well, the underlying numbers that we're looking at. We can expose some of those numbers in a report, if you like, about a particular area. Our final section we've described as modeling analysis, and Katrina and I were talking about this yesterday. How do we best describe this? No good way of describing it, but these are basically processes that we can go through to model the terrain. Things like change detection. This is a very important one and a very useful one. Detecting differences between terrain surfaces. Katrina is actually going to show us a very interesting application for this. Watershed analysis. You're actually seeing the results of that on the right side of the screen here. Determining water flow, determining catchment, things like that. And finally, viewshed, the ability to see from a defined location in multiple directions. What is visible, what is out of view. And we'll take a look at that one as well. So again, we have a lot to cover in the next, well, under an hour. Gosh, it's quite possible we may overshoot the top of the hour. If we do, I want to make sure we cover everything we need to, with apologies if we end up taking a little bit more time out of your afternoon or morning or whatever. But it is worth waiting for. This content is very, very useful and very, very interesting. Over the course of the next hour, we're going to visit two specific locations, and we're going to switch between myself and Katrina. Katrina gets to visit the West Coast. She'll be spending time on Mount St. Helens. Most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the mountain in Washington State. Erupted in 1980, I think, early 1980s. And we're going to take a look at some specific scenarios related to that geographic area. I, on the other hand, am staying close to home here. We're in the state of Maine, so I'm going to visit and spend some time looking at the terrain in our tallest mountain, around our tallest mountain, which is Mount Katahdin. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and bring up Global Mapper and actually have the workspace loaded already. Here's my 3D view. You may have seen this. Those of you who arrived early, we had a little bit of a fly around going. This is what you were looking at. We're looking at obviously the visual representation of the area. You're looking at imagery here, but underneath that you're looking at terrain, and that's what's giving us this 3D perspective, and that's ultimately what we're going to be spending time. But we thought we'd begin with just a little bit of eye candy here. Mount Katahdin. Geographic perspective, it's mid-Maine, central Maine. Those of you who are avid hikers, it is the northern terminus of the Appalachian Trail. If you're ever considering to do a multi-month walk from Georgia to Maine, this is where you'll end up. And actually we'll take a look at some of that data in just a little bit, some of the Appalachian Trail data. So I want to spend some time here talking about some of the elements of our terrain and 3D analysis. I'm going to turn the imagery off. It's good to have that visual context initially, but I'm going to turn the imagery off, and we have our terrain. Now, those of you who have never worked with terrain, never used the terrain functionality in Global Mapper, you'll notice already that this has got this interesting multicolor visualization. This is what we refer to as a shader. The shader can have many functions depending on which is selected. In this case, it's quite clear, based on the legend that's appearing on the left side of my screen, that the colors reflect specific elevations. You're looking at from about 360 meters all the way up to over 1,600 meters, reflecting in these colors. This shader is what we refer to as the Atlas shader. It is the default. If you load a terrain layer into Global Mapper, this is what you'll see. And it immediately gives you, from an analytical perspective, the lay of the land. And that's ultimately what we're doing here. We're analyzing the terrain characteristics. By changing the shader, we can change that representation. There are a number of options available in the drop-down from my toolbar here to choose a different shader. I'm not going to show all of these, but feel free if you've got a copy of Global Mapper to play around with some of these. One I want to show you specifically is a slope shader. The slope shader will display the terrain in a completely different way. Instead of looking at elevations, now what we're looking at is the steepness of the slope, the local slope steepness. And you'll notice on the legend on the left side, where previously they were meter values, now they're degrees. The darker the colors, the steeper the slopes. Now, this will give you an indication right away that there's some fairly steep slopes in this area. Katrina, you've been at the top of Mount Katahdin, I believe. It is a fairly abrupt drop-off, if I'm not mistaken.
It is fairly steep, yeah. And I'll also mention, David, there's a question about quickly displaying the slope information. And actually, if you look in the bottom left corner of the application, you can actually see the exact value where the cursor is. We could show that as a pop-up as well by enabling the info tips.
Yeah, there's a couple of different ways. Info tips, I'm not going to enable, show you where to do that. If you're using Global Mapper from the view menu, enable info tips, it will give you a dynamic display as you move around. Some people like to do that. I prefer not to. I prefer to keep my map clean. But yes, Katrina mentioned bottom left corner will give you dynamic information about the height, the slope. And we're going to be looking at some of those variables when we get into the quantitative analysis section. There's a little bit of overlap. Obviously visual also involves numbers. So there's overlap between those kind of three subsets. But yeah, we'll be taking a look at some slope information a little bit later. So again, just
and this is a sort of, I was just going to say, it's sort of a nice general overview and also can be those specific details if you do want to see that exact slope value or elevation value at a specific location.
Absolutely, absolutely. And actually, I'm going to show a little more of a process-based analysis of all of our slope statistics a little bit later. That's one of our quantitative analysis sections. Back to our sliders. We're kind of the easy stuff here, the visual stuff. Slope direction shader. Now, this is going to look a little bit messy. But if you get your mind around what we're looking at here, noting the legend again, these are degree values based on compass points. This is the aspect or the kind of orientation of the slopes. Depending on where you are in the world, you may be interested in north-facing slope or south-facing slopes. And you can see that quite clearly here. The red area is indicating my south-facing slopes. In this case, maybe somewhere where I'm interested in placing a solar farm or, certain types of agricultural practice, etc. So this visualization, again, doesn't actually show the actual elevation, but shows the orientation of the slope. Now, the other thing we can do with the shader is actually build our own shader. It's a very simple process, and I like to do this just based on some more, earth tone colors. You can do this either based on actual values, or you can do it based on an interpolation of limited values. And I'll show you what I mean in just a second. I'm going to type a value of 1 here. I'm going to apply a color, and I'll make that color a green color. Now, obviously that, for 1 meter, if it was taken literally, that would be the color that will be applied. I'm going to apply 10 meters. We're going to do a value of 10 meters, and I'm going to make that, let's make it a white color. And click OK. Now, if this was applied as is, obviously it would only reflect the range of values here. But what I want to do is I want to scale this so the shader applies to the range of elevations that I have visible. And that option is right here. So if I have a 1,000 meter range or 10,000 meter range, it will still interpret the colors or interpolate the colors based on these ranges. I'm actually going to add one more. I'm going to add one at 5, halfway point. And let's make that, I don't know, maybe an earth tone color. We'll do a brown color in here. And click OK. And make that, change that value. And we'll make that 5. So this is just an example of a custom shader, as you can see. And you can see the visual representation of what that will look like on my map here. Again, the numbers themselves in this context don't mean anything because we're scaling it. You could hard code specific numbers if you wanted. We'll click OK on that. It's called Custom Shader 1, and you can see it's a slightly different change of how the terrain is represented. We haven't changed the underlying data. We've just changed how it's visually represented. The other thing that's displayed here by default visually when we're working with terrain is what we call a hill shader. And there's a toggle in the toolbar for turning that on and turning it off, enabling or disabling. This is without the hill shader. It's the same data. You see the texture really provides a little context and certainly helps you in terms of analyzing the lay of the land. So it's a good idea to keep that on. We can change the characteristics of the shader. The implied sun angle by default is 45 degrees. That would be northeast, and 45 degrees above the horizon. But if you want to change that and have the implication that the sun is in a different location, there's an option here right next door, what we refer to as our dynamic hill shading, to change that. You can literally pick this little sun up and drag it around, and you'll see in real time it will reflect a different sun angle on my map display. A few other options in here as well in terms of how that shader appears. I like this direct light option. This will give me reflections as well as shadows. I think it works best if I reduce the sun angle slightly. And you're starting to see as I move my sun around, a little bit of a gloss almost that appears with reflected light as well as shadows. So This is just one illustration of how you can customize the display of terrain for your particular purpose, generating this custom shader. There's also an option, not something we talk about a lot, but to use multiple light sources. So where we have a single light source, the sun obviously, you can pretend there's actually multiple sources of light, whatever number you want. I'll apply 2 here just as an example. This doesn't reflect what you would see in the real world, but it gives you a better kind of perspective of light from both directions. You're not getting those hard shadows as before. And as you move the sun around, the other one will alternate in its opposite direction, as you'll see. And it just tempers the shadows just a little bit, giving you a little more light where previously there would just have been shadow. So again, just a few examples of the visual representation of terrain. And obviously, to do this justice, we'll pop our 3D view up again, and we'll see this with our new shader pattern. Previously we had some imagery up here, and you can see now this earth tone shader that I've created here representing areas above the tree line on Katahdin. Another way to visualize terrain is through profiling. The profile tool is right here in my toolbar. You draw a path. It creates a profile line. For this example, we're going to do something a little different. You may have seen profiles generated in previous presentations. What I'm going to do in this case is I'm actually going to profile an existing line. And to make this a little more meaningful, I'm actually going to bring in a small section of the Appalachian Trail. This is literally the terminus of the trail. It ends at the top of the mountain. Some of you may have hiked this Springer Mountain, Georgia to Mount Katahdin. This apparently is the most arduous day of all, this final day where you're literally climbing to the top of the mountain. What we're going to do with our profile tool is see how hard that climb really is. Rather than manually drawing a line, I'm going to use my digitizer. I'm going to select the line that already exists. And we have an option then to generate our profile. So from the analysis measurement menu, path profile. This can be done for one or more line features. Basically generates your cross-sectional view. And you can see very clearly here, it's all climbing. On the last day of your hike, it's all climbing. Actually, it's not quite all climbing, because one of the things that we can do here is we can look at a more extensive array of statistics related to this profile. This is an option when you right-click in the profile view, show me the details. And here you can see, if I'm planning my last day of hiking, I can see things like, well, what's the end height? What's the start height? How much of how long is it in straight line? How long is it in 3D? How much climbing am I going to do? And how much descending? Well, obviously there's not much descending on the last day of our hike. But you can see here we can get a complete report of the path. In this case, literally, it is a path or a trail, and all of the necessary details, which you can copy to the clipboard and paste into your plans for your hike along the Appalachian Trail. Obviously, you could do this for the entire section of the trail, not just this small end part. So you could get an idea as to the statistical breakdown of the trail as you're hiking it. So.
And David, we also have a question about saving that profile data. So there are options in the file menu to save it, to export it.
Yeah, we're actually going to get there in just a second. Hold that.
Great. Okay.
Hold that thought. The good segue here. I'm going to actually bring the profile up again. I didn't mean to close it. Let me go to analysis measurement and path profile again, because I'm actually going to dock this window as well to keep it on display down below. This profile view, by the way, the little yellow dots indicate the vertices in this line. That's why you're seeing those. You can opt to display those or not, as the case may be. But in terms of exporting, there's a number of different options. Right-click, and you'll see from the file menu different ways of saving this. Before I do that, I'm actually going to conduct a slightly different way of profiling. Instead of profiling along the path itself, I'm going to create perpendicular profiles. This is a process whereby I can create essentially profiles that cross the path to see the local lay of the land. I'm going to go to the options for the settings rather for the layer. I'm going to enable the display of my perpendicular profiles. I'll make my spacing, I don't know, maybe we'll make it about 25 meters here. So we'll get a profile view incrementally spaced along the path. And I can also define the length of each profile, which I'll make 1 kilometer, and click OK. Now, the results of this, when I enable this, will be rather than showing a single long profile, it's actually showing me one cross-section across the path. Now, this gives me a cross-sectional view. This is where my trail is, and this is the local lay of the land laterally. And I can use the arrow keys here to transition through the terrain, as you can see, moving along. or I can use the arrow keys on my keyboard. And you're probably not getting this effect on the streamed version of this, but it's a smooth kind of animation as I work my way up the trail. You can see myself climbing towards the top. So this perpendicular profile tool gives you this kind of cross-sectional view laterally based on a line you either draw or a line you create with a profile tool. You can then export these, or you can generate vector lines. Someone mentioned about saving these. You can generate vector lines. Right click once again from the file menu. I'm going to write these into a new layer. All my cross profiles, that's perfectly fine. We'll click OK. What I'm going to get here on the screen, you'll see these little green lines. I want to close the profile itself. And you can now see, if I zoom in a little closer, they're labeled. So I actually want to disable the labels just for visual clarity here. And we can actually pop these up in 3D. If I turn the underlying terrain off, I'll turn my trail off as well, and I'll pop these up in 3D. Now this gives you an interesting 3D perspective. If they were a little closer together, obviously you would see them a little tighter, but this is the local terrain. We're again dealing with visual analysis. This gives us this cross-sectional perspective along a linear path based on these cross-sectional views. So multiple ways of exporting those, and certainly these being in 3D vector form now, they could be exported to any 3D format. So those are just some examples of visualization of terrain. Katrina, I believe you're going to share with us probably what's one of the most common ways of visualizing terrain. That's through contouring.
Yeah, absolutely. Just switch screens here. So as David alluded to earlier, I'm actually looking at some data from Mount St. Helens, and obviously we've chose some kind of dramatic terrain examples here just because it makes a little bit more interesting of visuals, but you can do this with all sorts of different terrain data that might have a little less drastic of slopes. But this is, right now we're looking at some terrain data from 2017 of Mount St. Helens. And I've also turned on here my little overview map so you can get a sense of the full extent of my data here. So I can zoom into different areas. So this is sort of the cone shape of the area here. And we also have, we're going to talk about a little bit later, some change detection and some comparison between different time periods here. There's actually been some magma intrusion into the kind of bowl area of the mountain here. But the first thing we want to do is do some basic contouring. So this is really easy in Global Mapper. I'm just going to go up to the Create Contours button on my toolbar here. It's actually going to suggest a good contour interval for me based on my data, so based on kind of the range of values that I have, but obviously I can tweak that. And we can go ahead and make some contours here. Let's start by just making kind of the default 50-meter contours here. So this is going to go through and find all those places across the terrain that match the contour height for each 50-meter interval. And there were a few options we had in terms of how to derive that and if we want to go the full extent of the data or not. And I also have some index contours going on here that I could have controlled. I kind of skipped over that section, but I have some boulder lines here that I might set to show a nice reference for every 10th contour. I might want to be a little bit bolder or some other interval kind of based on what my contour intervals are. Another kind of hidden feature which we like to show is I can actually, instead of using these brown lines, I might actually want to show these as colored lines matching my elevation shader here. So I'm going to just double click on my layer here and go into the line styles. And instead of the default style here, I'm actually going to switch this to what's called an elevation line. And let's make it a little bit bigger here just so we can see it clearly. So this is actually going to color my lines based on that elevation shader. And if I turn on, I have some reference imagery here, you'll really get the effect. So this might be an interesting way to, maybe combine some different data layers. Just one option here for kind of representing lots of different data and kind of blending that information, both the imagery and also, contour data in this kind of contextual view. These are line features that can be edited, so we might want to apply some additional smoothing or simplification. So we have those options just by selecting them and choosing to edit them. Let's just do that once, just to show how that works. So I'm just going to select all of my contours here. And I've actually already got that tool up in my favorite list here since I did it recently, but this is in the digitizer context menu. I go down to move, reshape, I can smooth out my contours here. And this one can kind of do as many times as you want to just kind of get rid of some of those jagged edges, kind of clean up those lines, depending on, you know, how cartographic versus how accurate you might want to make this presentation. So these are some basic contours. There's a few other tools I'll point to in the contour tool. Let's go back one more time to that dialog. Let's go back to our terrain data here just for context. So rather than contour intervals at every height, I can actually create a contour just at a specific height. So for this particular data, I might be interested in data above a certain elevation. So I'm going to just generate a contour for the data above 2,400 meters. And this time I'm actually also going to turn on this generate area features option. So instead of just a single line, I'm going to actually make an area feature that tells me all the area that is above that elevation. Let's go ahead and run that quickly here. So this is going to have an area feature that I might be able to use as reference here, or maybe compare with some other data to get a sense. So let's move down here a little bit because most of this is on the bottom of the ridge line. So everything inside of this colored polygon is areas above 2,400 meters at or above that elevation. You can do that for you know, multiple heights as well if you want to kind of chunk your data into those different area categories. You can get a sense of the aerial extent of everything above that elevation. So lots of options with the contouring tool. One more that I won't run, but that I will mention is we can also create peaks and depressions. So finding local high points and low points throughout the data set. Either for our entire terrain grid we can do it, or kind of across the different areas based on some kind of minimum saddle distance or minimum dip between the two peaks to define those as distinct peaks. So that is also some really useful analysis as well.
Katrina, just a couple of questions related. Sorry to interrupt. A couple of questions come in. Just somebody asking about exporting contours. What formats can you export those contours in? I guess worth acknowledging that there are vector lines. And yeah,
absolutely. So all sorts of vector formats that we can support. Common ones might be something like a shapefile, or you know, a KMZ or a KML. You know, all sorts of CAD formats as well. We have probably over 100 vector formats that you can export to, so it's hard to list them all, but you know, a lot of the common vector packages that you might take to the web or to another GIS or CAD application are supported for export with that particular vector layer data set. So we would just either go to the file menu, or you can right click on a specific layer and export that. And actually, if I bring up that list here, you can get a sense of some of the options here. You know, all sorts of CAD and GIS data formats, but commonly you might do something like a Google Earth KML, or you know, a shapefile that a lot of other GIS programs use, or a CAD file like a DWG or a DXF. Those are all options in here. Are there other questions you want to throw at me, David?
This one you might
keep going?
This is one that I know I've been asked before, and maybe you can help me. There's somebody has asked if the label for the contours can be placed in the line itself. I believe you can actually create a custom feature type in which the text is actually sitting on the line, as opposed to the default, which Katrina is displaying, is the contour feature type. But I believe if you go into the styles, you can create a custom style where you center. There you go, right there, center the line.
Yeah, so either for the feature type, or since I am actually specific to the layer right now.
Right.
So I can center it on the line. I can also, you know, go in and do things like with this data in particular, especially with the imagery. Sometimes it's nice to have a bit of a halo there. So those are all options. Actually, you know, different options there to kind of stylize that. You can play around with those, the font and what kind of background you want. Shall we keep going here with looking at some quiver plots?
Please do. This is one of my favorite tools.
Okay. So David showed some interesting examples of shaders that showed the slope steepness and also the slope direction. But we're actually going to kind of take advantage of another vector tool here to kind of create a different visualization that gives us a sense of where the really steep slopes are. So we're going to use a quiver plot, which can be used in all sorts of contexts to show things that have you know, varying directions and magnitudes, and use that to show some information about our slopes. So we've actually gone ahead and set up ahead of time a kind of regular grid of points. You can do that just by using the grid tool here. There's an option to create, rectangle grids, line grids, or a grid of points. So we've gone ahead and done that, and I'm going to go ahead and turn that layer on. And let's just bring it to the top here so that we can see it. So we just have a bunch of points across our data set, and now we're going to give these some information about our elevation layer so that we can show some of those slope statistics. So first I'm just going to select all of those point features. And then with my digitizer tool here, I want to go into calculate elevation slope stats in my attribute functions here. And this is going to give me some slope statistics for each point and some elevation statistics for each point based on that reference terrain data. So all that information has been applied to these points now. And the last thing that I'm going to do is actually create this quiver plot visualization. So let's clear our selection here. So instead of just showing a simple dot symbol here, let's actually take a look at the slope information that each attribute now has. So if I go to point styles, this time I want to use a quiver plot. And we're going to use some attributes here as the direction and the magnitude. So some of the values that have been added here are slope direction and then the magnitude. So we can use either the slope degree or the slope percent. I'm actually going to use the slope percent because it shows a little bit more drastic change here. We have some really steep slopes that have a very high percentage. But either option is good here. So this is going to create little arrows, and let's just zoom in so you can see this, and you can customize these styles. But I can start to pick out some of these areas where there's really steep slopes and then what direction that slope is showing. So this might be particularly useful for some of these areas that have had some recent rock slide or landslides along this rim here. I might be able to identify some of those areas. So a really interesting visualization there, kind of a little workflow to show that information. And we could bump up those point symbols as well, kind of depending on how much information you wanted to show. But another interesting way to kind of combine two different data sets in one vector visualization.
Yeah, and that tool for applying or calculating elevation slope stats can be applied to lots of different data. So any vector files that you have sitting on the terrain, and you can consider this another method of analysis, can be now applied to points or to lines or to polygons. And this is just an example where we get this visualization, this quiver plot, again, direction and magnitude. Okay.
Yeah, you might have, a property or a parcel that you want that kind of statistics on. What's my average slope direction? What's my change in slope or change in elevation across that area?
Sure.
So, yeah, all those options.
Query just to find, like show me all the slopes that are steeper than a certain percentage. Absolutely. So again, we could play with these tools all day. I'm going to continue here. I'm going to come back to the East Coast again. I'm going to take the screen back, Katrina, and let's go ahead and we're back to Mount Katahdin again. I've restored the original shader. We're kind of moving into the second kind of type of analysis. So what we've done to this point is visual analysis. We looked at various ways of looking at the terrain, profiling, etc. Contouring obviously is a common one. We want to start talking about some numbers now, a quantitative analysis. And for this, I want to illustrate a tool for calculating a pile volume. Now, those of you who have been through presentations we've done in the past will be familiar with some of the workflows. Draw a boundary around a pile, simply calculate, and then we get our numbers. Yeah. I'm going to do something a little different here. I'm going to simulate the creation of a body of water. Now, little do the folks in Baxter State Park in Maine know that there's actually a dam being constructed right across the valley here. Please don't tell them. But I'm going to show the process of creating
I'm not sure they know you're joking here.
Yeah, don't do.
I better put in some obligatory laughter.
Yeah, right. This is not real, by the way. We live in a hypothetical world, Katrina and I. So what I'm going to do, just to kind of give an illustration of how we can measure volume or capacity, I'm going to create a body of water here. And I'm going to do this in a few steps to show you some other tools. The source data I have my terrain obviously here. This is a 3-meter resolution terrain. I have this line, or this rectangle. It started as a line. I buffered it. The only meaningful characteristic of this line, if I use my info tool, is got a single attribute, and that is a height value. Now that's key here, because what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create some local terrain here. We're talking about terrain analysis. I'm going to generate some local terrain. I'm going to grid this. I'm going to generate a grid much as we would if we had LiDAR data, except this is going to be a grid derived from a polygon. Use exactly the same tool as we've done before. Sat through any of our presentations. We've done this so many times. There's only one vector layer active. That's my layer with a little dam polygon. I'm going to click OK. And the only thing I'm going to specify here is a very tight resolution, just to remove some of the jagged edges around the polygon when this surface is generated. Nothing else needs to be changed here. I'm going to leave everything as is. We are, as part of this process, converting vector into terrain raster. We'll click OK. Can't see it right now because it's sitting under my polygon. I'll turn off the polygon, and you can see now we have a local modified version of my terrain. Easiest way to see this is actually in 3D. And we can see where we're constructing our containment dam here. And it's specific to that height that I had in the vector feature. A little serrated here. This is simply because of the texture and because of the hill shade. But that is now, the terrain has now been modified with that dam feature. So what I'm going to do next is I want to delineate the area that will be enclosed within the body of water. Now, how would I do that? What would be the best way of doing it? Well, we've already looked at this tool. I'm going to use the contouring tool. And I'm actually going to use a version of what Katrina had showed us. I'm only going to generate a contour at a specific height. Now, the height here, I'm going to make this about 5 meters below the top of my dam. I have to look at my notes here. The dam was 1,050. I'm going to make this 1,045. And again, making sure that we're only generating that one contour. I don't want my peaks and depressions. Katrina had mentioned these previously as well. Everything else here should be fine. We click OK, and it should eventually generate for us actually a couple of contours. We're going to get the contour that will enclose this area of interest to me. We'll also get the area beyond the bounds of my dam that I'm not really interested in. In fact, I'll delete that. I'm just interested in this small segment that hopefully it will generate here in just a minute, showing me my area of interest. I probably should have constrained this to my screen so it wasn't busy creating contours for areas that I'm not interested in, but it's almost there.
So we do have a question while we're waiting for this about accessing terrain data. So I just wanted to take a minute to mention that Global Mapper does have a number of built-in online sources available. Some of those are including terrain data. So things like, for global coverage, the SRTM and ASTER data, worldwide coverage. In the US, we have a lot of freely available elevation data. So we are looking at some, 10-meter resolution and better data. But worldwide, we do connect to data sources that are 30 meters, 1 arc second. There's some kind of differences in resolution there. And then obviously, based on whatever local GIS or government authorities, there might be some other publicly available data as well. And also we work with all sorts of, detailed high resolution sensor data that might have been collected for a local area.
Yep, lots of different sources.
So a little overview of how you might get some of this data to do your own analysis.
Yeah, we consciously avoided that question in this presentation, knowing we had limited time. We said, well, let's pretend we have the data already. How do we analyze it? Rather than going, so how do we get the data to begin with? That's a whole other story for another day. In the meantime, I was able to generate my contour, my single contour of interest. This is 1,045 meters. I want to convert this into a polygon. This is a line feature. Contours, as you know, are lines. Very simple. Select it. It's a digitized line. I've got a tool here in my toolbar, convert line to area. I can just go with the defaults here. Everything's fine. I want to make a few changes here. I want to change how it's displayed. This is going to represent a body of water, so I wanted to make it look like a body of water. We'll pretend the water is kind of a light blue color, maybe even semi-transparent. Solid borders, fine. I don't want to show my labels. I click OK. The other thing I want to do here is, because this is a 3D feature, because it's derived from elevation, I want to specify what that altitude actually means. In this case, it's an absolute elevation as opposed to relative to ground. Otherwise, it would be 1,000 meters above the ground. Not something we need. So that's absolute. I think that should be fine. Click OK. Oops, sorry, give it a name. We'll call it lake. and click OK. This is the layer that I've just named, by the way. So there we have now, hopefully if I deselect, there's my lake. I just generated a lake. Now, the objective of this exercise was calculating volumes. Believe me, we're going to get there. This is the steps to get there. Let me turn off a few layers here. The generated contours is just one contour. I don't need that anymore. I have my polygon. Quickly looking at that in 3D, by the way. Again, please don't tell the folks in Baxter State Park that this is a project we're planning. They better... they should not know about this, but this is what the body of water will look like 5 meters down from the dam area. What I want to do next is simply determine how much water this will contain. And this is my volume calculation. This is the application for this tool, of which there are many, many, many different types. Simple process. Select the polygon. In this case, obviously, the polygon I generated from my simulated body of water. Right-click, analysis measurement, and pile volume. You may have seen us use this in many, many different examples, but this is very specifically going to be a negative number, a capacity. You'll note cut and fill here. We had a question come in earlier about cut and fill. You can also create a situation where you can generate cut and fill volumes to create an equilibrium between what's cut and what's filled within a certain area. Again, that's a story for another day. Quickly running this calculation, it's just going to be a report. It will pop up some numbers for me here. As I've mentioned, we are in the quantitative area. And how many zeros do we have here? 10 million, just about 10, almost 11, is that 10 million? It is 10 million. 10 million plus cubic meters of water will be retained if that dam is constructed and the water level is within 5 meters of the top of the dam. Now, what's really interesting about this, one of my colleagues actually brought this up when I did a demonstration for this last week. You could generate multiple contours to see what the difference in capacity will be with a reduction in water level. If the water level goes down to 1,000 meters, how much water would be left? So you can conduct all sorts of calculations. Now, the final thing I want to do in this workflow, it's not really analysis, but it's fun to play with. If I go into the 3D view, I'm actually going to change my perspective to what we call walk mode. This allows me to simulate me walking on the terrain. And actually, I'm right below the water here already. I'm walking underneath where the water will be. I'll pop up above the surface here in just a second, and you'll see, there we go. So I'll turn around and look at my lake. So you can get a very realistic perspective. We'll go up onto the ridge here. Lena was complaining about being seasick when I showed her this yesterday, and we can take a look down to see what that body of water would look like. I'm literally walking over the terrain now, and when I get to the water, whoa, we're going underneath. We're doing a little scuba diving here, so you can see what the bathymetry looks like, the sea level, subsurface terrain looks like. Again, the objective was volume calculation with a little fun along the way, but that volume calculation process can be applied in many, many different situations. I've got
this one has sparked all sorts of questions, David, which I'm not sure we have time for, but I will just mention that this was kind of a quick example. We do have, all sorts of options for that initial area feature being, different elevations, kind of sloping out away from the area. We can do that kind of modeling as well.
Yeah.
And then, different options for how we measure that water surface and what we're doing for that volume calculation in terms of, a specific height or, a kind of measured 3D area that we're measuring the volume inside of, but
exactly.
Just scratching the surface here.
Yeah, definitely. The question on the complex surfaces, the key here is I can convert any vector feature into terrain using that gridding tool, and that will give you the kind of that bridge between, something you've digitized maybe in AutoCAD and being able to model that in a 3D context and derive all of the statistics. Speaking of statistics, before I hand back to Kat again, there's one more thing I want to show you. I want to turn off my dam. It isn't real, by the way, just making sure that the story is clear. There is no dam and no lake being planned in Mount Katahdin, Maine. So you've heard it here. I'm going to turn on the basic terrain again. And I've actually got a polygon I generated here, unimaginatively called extent. This is just a kind of a polygon denoting the high level within this area. What I want to do is conduct an analysis of the overall statistics of the terrain in this area. Once again, we are in the kind of quantitative analysis section. Very simple process. And actually, Kat showed us this in the context of the points that she generated. When you have a polygon, there's a lot more detail that's going to be derived. Select the polygon sitting on top of your terrain, right-click. Once again, we're under analysis measurement, and we wanted to calculate the elevation slope stats for the selected feature. In this case, we have the option here of creating a min and max point. Let's go ahead and say yes to that. And this is going to run through, it's analyzing literally all the pixels and it's going to come up with a summary report for me. As you will see in just a second, I'm going to actually use my info tool to bring this up immediately. If I click the info for the polygon, you'll see now attributes that have been assigned to that include the min-x elevation, where it's located, the max elevation, all of the slope information. So as you can see, I'm not going to read every detail, but this is a very, very detailed report of the characteristics of the terrain within a defined area. Now, this could be a corridor, it could be a very localized area, or in my case, obviously, a big swath of the area covering the mountaintop. But you do get this report, and it's automatically added as attributes to the selected feature that was used to derive the extent of this. So again, another quantitative analysis function. Time to go back to Mount St. Helens again. I'm looking forward to seeing this one. This is going to be interesting. Katrina is going to tell us a little bit about how we can work with multiple data sets, multiple terrain layers, and detect some change, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. So this particular data set, we do have data from 2 time periods. So originally we were looking at the 2017 data. We also have some data from 2002. And as you see those 2 layers loaded quickly, you can start to see some of the differences here. So there was some activity over those years. I think between about 2004 and about 2008, there was this magma chamber that was starting to develop. So one easy way to look at this is to start by using the image swipe tool. So this is going to allow me to visually peel back one layer and kind of reveal the information underneath. And as I start to do that over this area, you can see this large magma dome that developed in the kind of bottom of this basin here. And I also have options to keep that swipe, so kind of pull it back and do sort of a comparative analysis. All sorts of different options there, but just kind of a quick visual comparison between these 2 layers. Another thing that I might want to do, let's turn off the image swipe here, and actually let's make sure we release that swipe. Great. So I might also want to profile this data, and I can actually show on my elevation profile more than one terrain layer. So I'm just going to go across the full extent here, and a little different than what David is doing. I've actually picked the profile tool from the toolbar here, and I'm just drawing a profile kind of across my terrain, so I can kind of flexibly generate that as well. And what you'll see here is I can actually show both terrain layers here. So I've enabled those options in my settings here to show both a legend and also show the multiple terrain layers. I can change these styles, switch up how these are shown. I can also reorder my layers here, so you see just the newer red fill here. Different options for exploring this data set. And with this tool, I can also sort of keep redrawing across different extents, kind of flexibly looking at different areas of my landscape and comparing them visually. And do things on the profile tool like, actually measure distances, measure the difference here between these different areas. So with the measure tool, I might want to do some calculation of just exactly how much difference there is between these 2 surfaces, or what the slope is at a particular location. So those are all options as well. If we wanted to do a more kind of quantitative change detection, we might actually measure the difference here. So let's start by measuring the volume between these 2 surfaces. I'm going to shut off my profile here first. So similar to what David was doing with an area feature, we actually have 2 kind of detailed terrain surfaces now, and so we can measure the volume between both of them. And that'll give us this kind of volume of magma in this situation, since that's the major thing that has changed between these 2 time periods. So I'm going to go to the analysis menu, and I want this measure volume between surfaces option. Got my 2 layers here. It doesn't really matter my order in this particular case, and I can choose what units I want here. We'll just stick with cubic meters. And this is going to compare those surfaces and come up with a volume calculation here. So this is my total volume between this area, and then also some statistics about my comparison surface as well. Kind of the average location of the average height and min and max heights across that terrain as well. And this copies to the clipboard, so you can put this right in the report, or your notes for this analysis, however you want to save that data. And last but not least, let's also look at some kind of visual comparison between these two change layers. And I can't resist doing a little bit of 3D as well, like David was doing. We can actually, let's make sure I've enabled multiple terrain surfaces here. Like with the water, we can actually go in 3D kind of inside of these two surfaces and get that comparison here. And I don't know how well this will stream, but if I get my my navigation at the right location here, I can actually see kind of inside of the two surfaces here between these changed time periods to kind of explore that volume that I just measured. And then if I want to show that kind of change across the landscape, so where are the areas that have gained elevation from that magma intrusion, and also there might be some areas that have lost some elevation. So I know in this particular case, there's been a little bit of probably erosion or landslide around this rim. So lastly, let's actually create a comparison layer. So I'm going to use this combine compare terrain layers tool. And this is going to give me a new layer that shows the difference here. So I'm going to start with my newer date and subtract my older date, so I get some positive numbers where I've gained and some negative numbers where I've lost. And we have all sorts of different operations that we can do here. In this case, we just want to do a subtraction that is signed, so the difference between gain and loss is represented. But you can also, combine data in all sorts of different ways. Maybe if you just have data from different sensors or different, slightly different measurements that you want to kind of merge into one, there are other operations that are available as well. Let's go ahead and generate that layer. And I'm actually going to set this to the shared shader here so that we can pick a nice shader here to visualize this change. So this is going to go through at each location and find those areas that have gained some height where that magma has intruded, and also areas that have lost height. And David has already gone through the custom shader here and the hill shade. Let's actually turn off the hill shade in this case so we can see this better. And I did make a custom shader for this as well. You can kind of set up your custom data that you want here. I'm just going to load the one that I've already generated here. So I just set up a shader. I'm going to shut off my other layers based on those values. So there's a few areas that have lost some land or had some erosion around the rim, and then there's areas that have gained. So I just made a custom fixed shader using those values and showing them with some color options that I wanted to use, so I can really see those areas of change across the landscape.
And you could generate contours to delineate change. Again, it should be stressed that this is not a terrain layer, but this is a difference layer. And if you want to visualize the difference using any of the other variables, a quiver plot or contours or anything like that, you can absolutely apply it to this layer as well. While I'm here, quite a few questions for which the answer is yes. Can you generate, yeah, not all of the questions are yes, but the ones I'm going to ask. Somebody asked if we could generate a subset of terrain based on a non-regular polygon, in other words, not a rectangle. Yes, you can. Does the software work with US units? I assume you mean feet, etc. Absolutely. That's a configuration option. I tend to keep mine with meters, but you can configure that whatever way you want. There was another one that was yes. I think I've lost it. There's a lot more questions coming in. I apologize, we can't answer all of them. We will follow up, as I mentioned before. And we are getting towards the top of the hour. Someone asked about creating a more color relief looking more natural. Katrina just mentioned there the idea of creating a custom shader. You can absolutely apply whatever colors you want to reflect whatever elevations to make it look more natural. Perhaps the most natural of all, Katrina, I don't know if you can show this while you have the screen, is to show the daylight shader. The daylight shader drops the colors off completely, and it leaves a single color. But you can change
daylight shader is probably blue.
Yeah, blue. Yeah, you can make that. There's an option to change that to white, in which case the most natural color would be no color at all, and that would obviously give you just the hill shade pattern with a white simulated white background. So multiple options there. Okay, very cool, very cool. I'm going to take the screen back, Kat, and I'm going to go back to.
Okay. I'll stop playing with my data here.
No, you can keep playing with your data. We're just not going to be watching you. Yeah. We're going back to Mount Katahdin again. No more dams. The dam was. Well, I scrapped the idea of the dam, by the way. I thought it wasn't such a good idea. I want to retain the pristine environment here. But what we are going to do is a little bit more modeling. We're going to do a watershed. Again, we're using kind of common data for all of this. You'll notice conspicuously placed over here on the side of my map is a red dot. For this particular watershed scenario, I want to define the extent of the catchment that ultimately flows to this point. This is one of the variations on the theme of watershed analysis that Global Mapper offers. There's a few others in there, but this is very specifically, what's the catchment? I probably should have done this before planning my dam, but that's okay. The watershed process is initiated from the toolbar. I'm not going to go through the details here. We're just going to change a couple of the settings. I'm going to dumb the data down just a little bit just to speed up the process. I do want to make sure I'm tracing the flow to that area rather than from that point. The from option would give you water drop analysis. Where would a water drop flow, all things being equal, if you placed it on the terrain? Where would it go to? That's not the question we're answering now. What we're answering is what would ultimately drain to that point? We're creating a single catchment or a single watershed. I'm actually going to limit the extent as well to speed this up a little bit. So I'll just use my screen extent. That probably works. Just verifying that that will work. I think that should be fine. I'm not going to go into, again, any more of the details. In the interest of time, we'll just click OK. And hopefully when this chugs along, we should see a couple of things. Oh, I just realized I forgot to change one other setting. We're going to get a lot of blue lines on the screen here. I could have reduced the threshold size, but we're going to get a lot of blue lines. I'll turn those off in just a second, but ultimately we will also get a polygon, which is really what we're interested in. And if this doesn't speed up, I may abort and redo that with the updated setting.
Yeah, so as a process of calculating that catchment area, it is going through and determining where those accumulations of water are going to derive and kind of how they're going to flow across the landscape.
Yeah.
So you can kind of choose what resolution you might calculate that at, but
yeah, and
yeah,
thank you for filling in, Kat. That was perfect. That was perfect. We do, as a byproduct of watershed, get these lines indicating where the potential for the terrain to support the flow of water based on that accumulation that Kat was mentioning. This is a pixel level analysis. We also get the polygon, which is really what I wanted. I want to turn off the lines. They're all in the same layer, as you can see. So what I'm going to do here, just a kind of little sidebar, I'm going to split this layer based on feature type.
Actually, you want to split the catchment layer, David.
Thank you. You're right. Catchment. Thank you. Based on feature type, I can hold my mouse steady. And yeah, catchment is fine. Thank you. That's good. And feature description. Now this is going to give us a little tree view here where we can turn off the streams, leaving a polygon. That can be done for any layer, by the way. It's just splitting up a layer based on certain characteristics. And ultimately, this is what I wanted. I can now see the catchment. Ultimately, what will ultimately flow to this point is defined by what you see here. Pop this up in 3D, and we'll see that superimposed on top of our terrain. That's my catchment for this area. So that's another example of a model-based analysis function in Global Mapper. And we are almost at the top of the hour. I have one more to show you, and this is viewshed analysis. I'm accumulating a lot of junk in my control center here. Let me turn off my watershed. I'll turn off the watershed point. The final option here is the little view icon, of a little camera icon. This actually holds a number of different characteristics I'm going to show you in just a second. But what I want to use this for is to determine what's visible. We're going to do a visual analysis. Now, this can be either done along a single linear path using the profile tool that Kat and I have both used. You can actually do line of sight analysis, or in this case, we're going to do a multi-direction visibility analysis. And this will be used literally for visualization, or if you're in kind of the broadcast technology field for the radio, what's the word I'm looking for, Kat? Transmission. That's the word, big word. Radio transmission, what would be covered and what would not be covered. So ours is obviously visual. We've just hiked the Appalachian Trail here, so we want to see what's going to be visible from when we get to the top. Viewshed is another button in our analysis toolbar. Again, not dwelling on the details here. We can either derive the viewshed from a clicked point, or if I click and it recognizes as a point selected, it will give me that option. So I want to generate the view for a point that's selected. I click yes. I'm going to bump my transmitter elevation just a little bit here. I'm going to be standing on my tiptoes. This is the height that I'm standing at. This is what I would see off in the distance. My radius is 4 kilometers. I don't need to see anything beyond that. What's the view from the top of the mountain? I don't have any data beyond that range anyway. I'm going to dumb this down a little bit again to speed it up. It's 3-meter resolution data. I'm going to dumb the analysis down to 5 meters, and we're looking in 360 degrees. Now, again, this should not take too long, but once this completes, we will get a visual representation. If I was standing at the top of Mount Katahdin, which someday I will, I'm looking off in all directions, what can I see? And hopefully this will not, as I said, take too long. Probably should have used some lower resolution data for this, or gotten a better processor.
So while we're waiting for that analysis, there are some advanced options in there as well if you are measuring a signal transmission. So free space path loss, and for null zones, you can kind of measure how that wave will actually decay as it spreads away from the tower site. So that's for kind of more advanced analysis where the area isn't just what you can visually see, but where you're actually trying to measure kind of signal spread out from a tower.
Right.
So those are kind of advanced functions in there as well.
And for broadcast applications, it's common as well to have multiple possible tower locations so you can see overlap, and we have a tool for counting overlap. So if you've multiple viewshed areas, encompassing an area, if you're dealing with the broadcast application, seeing where there's multiple signals is useful. So here we can see what's visible. When I actually did this originally, it surprised me a little bit that we're not seeing a lot of the terrain in close. And if you know the kind of lay of the land here, it is a fairly flat top right here, so it's you're not seeing over the edge of the ridge. Kat, you've been here. This is pretty much true to form, you believe?
It is, yeah. There's a pretty big peak on that kind of left side of your screen there.
Yep.
And you can, I think actually the view from Pomolo Peak, which is the right end of the ridgeline, is actually a little bit better than the top.
We'll do that one next time. One final thing I want to do here just to validate this. Actually, I'm going to turn off my viewshed for this. So we're going to show what it actually would look like. I have a little trick here. I'm going to bring up, oh, that's not what I want either. Let me turn off my Appalachian Trail. I think I've got too many layers on here. I'll try this one final time. Using the little camera icon, I have a link, and it's going to bring up my web browser off screen inevitably. I'll drag it into view in just a second when it pops up. If it pops up, and here it is. Here's Google Chrome with a street view, a way to finish this. Now we're dealing with terrain analysis in a simulated form. This is the real world. This is the view from the top of Mount Katahdin, literally the end of the Appalachian Trail. And this confirms what we were expecting, what we can see in the distance. Obviously, we're not seeing too much over the edge of the slope here. So we did a quantitative modeling based application for what we can ultimately see in real time looking at Google Street View. There's a lot more questions. I'm looking at this question. I think this is the most questions we've ever gotten. It's overwhelming. If you asked a question and did not get an answer, which I think is most of you, we will be following up. Please give us a few days to have some folks answer your questions. You'll get an email with the responses. There will be a blog post created as well with all of those questions and answers. If you're watching the recording of this, there should be a link to that blog post right in the description right below where you can get those answers. We went too bad, just a couple of minutes over the top of the hour. I was thinking we'll go a little bit longer than that, but I think we're pretty fast today, Kat. Katrina, thank you so much for your help today. It's always good to get a partner in crime that can show some of these tools.
Yeah, thanks, David.
Okay, and for the rest of you, we're as you can see, we're going to continue this series. 2 weeks from today, as we mentioned, we're going to do another little tips and tricks, kind of looking at a lot of different applications of Google Mapper. In the meantime, if you're new to the software, there are a couple of things you can do. You can download a trial. You'll see the URL at the bottom, bluemarblegeo.com/trial. You can go right in there and download it. People have asked that question as well. How do I use Google Mapper? It's a 14-day free trial. You can use all of the tools that I showed you today. Lots of different data sources you can pull data in from. You can watch the presentation and try to simulate some of the things that we've been doing here. If you're interested in some of our licensing options, network licensing or dongle licensing, orders at bluemarblegeo.com. If you're watching the recording and you have additional questions, your best bet is to email geohelp@bluemarblegeo.com, and the folks in our tech support crew will be more than happy to help you with whatever questions you have. Thank you so much for joining us today, folks, and we will see you next time.